Hello everyone. I just want to let you know we're going to start about 5 minutes late. There was a big traffic accident on 25. Hopefully you all avoided that, but we're still waiting on quite a few people. So please have a snack, a cup of coffee or tea, and we'll begin shortly.
Yeah, so
All right, everyone, we're going to get started. If you want to grab your coffee and tea and gather over this way. A couple people are still coming in. All right, hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for Samira Mehta's Author Talk and book launch of The Racism of People That Love You. I'm Joy Alice Eisenhower. I'm the Director of Arts and Culture here at the Boulder JCC, and we are so honored to host this program this evening. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Rose Foundation, SCFD, CCI, the Lichter family, and we acknowledge that all of our arts and culture programming is made possible by the generous support of our donors, sponsors, and many of you here tonight. So thank you so much for supporting us. There will be a book signing, yes, big cheers to all of you, thank you. There will be a book signing and reception immediately following the program. This will give you an opportunity to speak with our presenters and to connect with one another. I want you to know that all of the single-use dishes and flatware at this program this evening are compostable. Along with your food waste, they can all of them can go into the green bin. Sorting your waste will help us reduce the impact on climate, and this is also one of our organizational values, to repair the world. I want to thank you for your help with this small but very important to us detail. And now, I would like to welcome our presenter. She's going to do a few readings, and then we'll welcome Dr. Jennifer Ho to the stage for a bit of conversation, and then we'll open up for Q&A. Samira K. Mehta is an Associate Professor of Women and Gender Studies and the new Director of Jewish Studies. Her research and teaching focus on the intersections of religion, culture, and gender, including the politics of family life and reproduction in the United States. Her first book, Beyond Chrismaka, The Christian-Jewish Interfaith Family in the United States, was a National Jewish Book Award finalist, and her most recent book that she is here to speak about tonight, The Racism of People That Love You, was just named #6 on Oprah's most anticipated books of the year. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Samira Mehta.
Thank you. I want to start, of course, by thanking Joy and the JCC and UUCB for co-sponsoring. And it's such a pleasure to be here to read and talk with you tonight. I want to particularly appreciate my friend Sarah, who flew in from Iowa to be here, and some of you who have I haven't been in Colorado very long, and so I would like to thank members of my Colorado family who have helped me find a home in the West. Some of you are here, and some of you couldn't be here and are watching on the live stream. And so in particular, I want to thank Charlie and Tova for hanging out with their dad on the live stream and being here. Charlie is 11 and Tova is 5, and they are the light of my life here in Colorado. And so I've never done this kind of book talk before, and I have a friend who's a bookseller, and her big advice was to tell stories, that you can read the book, you can buy the book and read the book, but I should tell you about writing the book, and I should tell you stories about writing the book. And so I am absolutely going to do that. And I'm going to start by saying, one of the things that I take for granted and I talk about a lot in the book, but you might need for context, my friend Sarah pointed out in the car on the way here, is to give you a sense of, I am Asian American. My father was an immigrant from India. He came here in 1971. I was born less than 10 years later, so he was relatively new to the United States. My mom is from a family, my mom's maiden name shows up in the records of New Haven Colony, in the city of New Haven, which is where I was born, in 1641. So my mom's family, you know, my great-grandmother got kicked out of the DAR for converting to Judaism to marry her second husband, my step-great-grandfather, right? We've been here for a long time on that side of the family. And so there are these two really different experiences of Americanness going on in the world that I'm writing about. And so that's the first story that is sort of in the book, but not quite. And I'm going to open with at the very beginning, very start of chapter 1. Where are you from? I am from a tiny town, nestled up against a small city, both in the shadow of a ridge. In a lot of ways, my little town doesn't have much of an identity on its own, but in my little city, we make the best pizza in the world. My little city also has a stunningly high murder rate, the highest per capita in the country, I was told when I was growing up in the 1980s, and an Ivy League university. But as we dislike the murder rate and are, at best, ambivalent about the university, the pizza is really what we prefer to lead with. Even though I left home when I was 18 with such a deep desire to get out of Dodge that I didn't even apply to our Ivy League university, and have never really thought about going back to live there, my little city remains the center of my universe. But where are you really from? When I explain that, all right, I'm not really from New Haven, Connecticut, I tell people that I'm really from Woodbridge, a tiny town outside of New Haven, which had, in my childhood, about 8,000 people and still lacks a grocery store. When I was growing up, you could not buy milk and eggs in Woodbridge between Thanksgiving and Easter because the farm stands were closed. Now we have a year-long farm stand, but it's very Tony. It's the kind of place where you can buy gourmet cheese and flatbread. You still, however, have to go to New Haven to buy toilet paper. I always like people better when they accept my answer of where I am from without asking a follow-up, because it means that they are engaging with me as I experience myself and not as they want to experience me. I once expressed a very snobby opinion about bagels while at a Rosh Hashanah dinner. The hostess, a lovely woman named Batia, who had accepted me, the childhood friend of her second cousin's husband, there at her holiday table, and she asked where I was from when she heard this snobby opinion about bagels. When I said New Haven, she nodded and said, "So, close enough to New York that you know a thing or two." I really liked her. When people accept my answer of where I'm really from, I know that they're interested in knowing something about me rather than simply finding the answer that they are looking for. They are interested in the stories, the landscape, and the location that root me, even though it has been more than half of my lifetime since I've routinely lived in the greater New Haven area. So, in all fairness, I wrote that part before I picked up and moved home for the first 3 semesters of COVID. So I've lived in New Haven a little bit more recently right now. And I go on in this to kind of give people a walking tour, like the nickel tour of New Haven, the version that I took one of my grad school best friends came home with me. And so it's the story of taking my friend Yoshimi around town. And so I go on to say, after that sort of description of my childhood home, but what I remember most from Yoshimi's response to my whirlwind tour of my hometown was this. Yoshimi spent her childhood following her father's academic career. He was a grad student in Tokyo, a postdoc in Toronto, had, I think, at least 1 or 2 visiting positions before the family settled in the home where Yoshimi spent junior high and high school. She was amazed by the stories about me and my childhood that were woven into our tour of New Haven. She thought she was going to see Yale. And yes, we went to visit the statue of Nathan Hale, who is somebody who was captured by the British and is reputed to have said, as they hanged him, "I only regret that I have but one life to give for my country." And yes, we went to visit the sculpture documenting the number of women at Yale through the ages. And that is a very depressing sculpture with its centuries of zeros. But her primary comment as we drove back up the hill to my little village outside of the city limits was that she was amazed at how I was connected to this place and how my memories layer on top of each other from toddler me through adult me. And that now that she had seen me there, she said, she could not imagine that one could know me without knowing this place where I had been raised. And it struck her, she said, because she lacks that grounding in place. I left, and I'm proud that I left and that I have seen more of the world. But New Haven and its suburbs remain very much where I am from. When people do not accept my answer, it tends to be because of one of two desires on their part. One with which I am in sympathy, but neither results in me giving the answer that they want, at least not without some resentment. South Asians ask me where I am from at as high a rate as white people, as it turns out, maybe even higher. Not, I hasten to add, Asian Americans. We, that is the Americans who live outside of the black-white binary of the racial binary of the United States, know better than to ask people where they are from, at least not without some sort of context for the question. South Asian immigrants or visitors, however, ask all the time, and I assume in some sort of search for connection. I've been asked where I am from by South Asian immigrants in places as disparate as the A train from JFK to Brooklyn, and in the Andover Theological Library of Harvard Divinity School from, as those locations might suggest, total strangers to new classmates. And there's a flip side, of course, to that question, and it's not about creating connection, however false that connection might be. The question, where are you from, in the hands of white people, does an entirely different type of work. When white people ask where I am from and press beyond my answer of New England, it means that they're saying, you are not really from here. When you call them on this answer, they often explain that they are just curious and want to get to know you better. Because of the world in which I live, these white people are often well-meaning liberals, rather than the people whose subtext ultimately is deliberately to say, you are not from here and you should go home. I have worked in colleges and universities and museums. I have worshiped in crunchy liberal Jewish and Unitarian communities, and almost always have lived in the hippie or hipster parts of town. I do everything I can not to encounter the kind of people who would tell me that I should go back home. As a side note, I'm not actually super successful about that, just for the record. Turns out that people are super willing to tell you to go back home on public transit and places like that, and they're unavoidable, but there you go. But the conversations that I kind of have in my spaces go something like this. I will be standing around in some sort of cocktail party or coffee hour situation, chatting with people. I will probably not have asked them where they are from. I assume that we are, all from roughly the place where we're standing. Maybe a synagogue hall in Atlanta, a city library in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a hippy-dippy food co-op in Philadelphia. And so, because they are people in these environments, I really do think that when they're asking me where I'm really from, they're asking from a place of well-intentioned curiosity. They really do somehow feel that knowing my heritage will help them know me better, connect with me better. But what they are really doing, whether or not they realize it, is trying to control my story, to tell how I tell it and at what speed I tell it. And though they would be horrified to realize it, when they ask me where I am really from, but do not ask each other, they are also saying that wherever I am from, the answer that I have given, the answer of Woodbridge, of New Haven, of here, wherever that here might be, of the United States, is somehow implausible. I cannot be from the place where I was born, or the place where I pay rent or a mortgage, in the only country that I have ever lived. And in fact, and this is embarrassing, but I will confess this all to you, I am, in fact, the kind of awful kind of American that doesn't leave very often. I just had to tell somebody that I've never spent more than 3.5 months at a clip, 4 months, I guess, outside of the United States. Like, I've never lived abroad. I've traveled, not a lot, but like a certain amount, but I've never been gone for as much as half a year, right? Like, so I'm even kind of unfortunate stereotypes about the United States in the end. And people ask me sort of what it was like to write this book. And I think that for me, it was this really interesting opportunity to name things that I had thought about, but hadn't really delved into, right? Those things that are kind of at the periphery of your vision, that are part of how you structure your life, but they're not really things that you understand. There may be things that make you angry, but you don't have them woven together in a story that you can make sense of. And so for me, writing this book was really an opportunity to make sense of some of those questions. And I wrote this book because of a conversation that I had with one of my best friends. We were sitting in a tapas bar in Washington, D.C., and I'm vegetarian, and he's super confused that I love this tapas bar because tapas is not generally a vegetarian-friendly food. And we were talking about the waves of hate that were sweeping the country. This was in the summer of 2016, and we were just sort of stunned, right, by what we were seeing around us. Or he was stunned, and he's white, and he's Southern, and I think he sort of thought that having grown up in such a place, right, like he would know how bad it could get, and it was just bad beyond his imagining. And in some ways, it wasn't bad beyond my imagining. It was as if what I was seeing was what I had always sort of wondered if that was what was percolating beneath the surface. Like every now and then something would happen, and I would be like, oh. Right? So I felt like I was getting like confirmation of something that I had always been afraid of. And he felt like his world was turning into a nightmare. And we were talking about that some. And I was actually saying that for me, I don't mean to say that I wanted what was happening or anything like that, but there was actually a comfort of feeling less crazy in having the sort of reality revealed. And it was making me feel a little bit more sane. As much as it was just the most horrible, it was as if it was having your worst assumptions confirmed, right? And now when I think that I thought the summer of 2016 was my worst assumptions, I wonder at the naivete, right? Like it just got worse and worse and worse. But he was asking me what it was like as a person of color to be living with that. And I said to him that, well, I found the blatant bigotry horrifying, and I found it terrifying. It wasn't the kind of hatred that hurts me, right? In the end, people who I don't know saying really horrible things on the television, it terrifies me, it frightens me, it fills me with dismay and disgust for the world. But I've always known that those people didn't think that I was fully human as a brown woman, so it doesn't hurt me. What hurts me is the sort of casual racism of the people who love me. And all of a sudden I had a title, and shortly thereafter I would have a title essay about one of the biggest fights that he and I ever had. Because what happened in that moment, and I write about this in the final essay, which I'm actually not going to read, I'm just going to tell you the story because I'm taking advice from that bookseller friend. So I wrote out you can tell I'm reading it, but I wrote out a different version so that you can still get something out of reading the book, right? That what came out of that conversation was an essay about the biggest fight that he and I ever had, or at least one of them, because he said to me, "Are you talking about me when you say that?" And the thing is that I hadn't really been talking about him until he asked the question, right? I had been thinking about every single moment that one of my white relatives said something that demonstrated that they had no idea what it was like to be me. I was thinking about every single moment that one of my Indian relatives revealed to me that I was fundamentally a disappointment to them for not being Indian enough when they had never actually taught me what it would be or how to be that Indian, right? It's not like I had rejected the lesson. I had never gotten the lesson, right? No one had given me the memo. And so I was thinking about all of those moments, but when he asked me that question, I couldn't say no to him, because we had had a horrible fight once that I write about in the book, and it had been a fight about TSA. I had been going to visit him, and I had been searched by TSA on my way. And I arrived at his house really traumatized by the extremely invasive search. And he wanted me to understand that TSA searching me like that was to make people safer. That since I am not a terrorist, and I know that I'm not a terrorist, and I know that when they go through my luggage in fine-grained detail and investigate bodily orifices that I was certainly not expecting to have anyone check out at the airport, that they're doing it to make the airplane safer for everyone, including me. And therefore, I should understand that this is part of what we do to get a safer society. And we had a horrible fight. We had an absolutely horrible fight. And I almost got on an airplane and went home, and I was visiting him in Europe. It would have been quite the thing to go home. And I didn't, and we stuck through it, and we had sort of a relatively good visit, and we just sort of buried it, right? We buried the entire thing. We buried the anger. We just sort of repressed and moved on, and actually continued to have a really lovely friendship. And then 7 years later, I said this thing, and all of a sudden he knew that I had to be talking about him. And that's where this book comes from. So I'm going to read 2 other little chunks, and then I'm going to invite Jennifer up. So I'm going to start with this from Failing the Authenticity Test, which is chapter 3. And this, I'm reading this because this is my editor's favorite chapter. I cannot pronounce my own last name. I have known this for almost, if not quite as long, as I have known my last name. I can remember sitting with my aunt years before she would marry and discard our shared last name, and her repeatedly making the consonant sound, the, which we do not have in English. First, she would make it on its own, and then in the context of our name, and I would repeat it after her. I never got it quite right, and beyond that, I could never quite hear the difference between what she was doing and what I was doing. The Hindi alphabet, you see, has 33 consonants and between 11 and 13 vowels, depending on which reckoning you're using. Each of those letters makes its own distinct sound. According to Before Their First Words, a project about human speech development out of the University of Barcelona, an infant can hear all of the sounds that exist in human speech, which amounts to 600 consonants and 200 vowels. Between the ages of 6 to 10 months, however, babies hone in on the sounds in their native language and not only lose the ability to focus on sounds that are not part of their native language, but also the ability to hear them. This is called perceptual narrowing or perceptual reorganization. Conveniently for me, the article produced by the Barcelona project that I am reading even uses the very letter that I'm talking about. The authors write, for example, a child exposed to English loses the ability to tell the difference between different types of T sounds, e.g. a dental T and a retroflex T, whereas a child exposed to Hindi or Urdu would retain this ability as the differences in sounds are used to mark differences in meaning in those languages. Presumably a child raised in a truly bilingual home, my nephew's home for instance, where one father speaks to him in daddy's native English and the other in papa's native Italian, would end up with a full complement of those sounds. My home was not such a home. My father may have spoken to me on occasion in Hindi, Punjabi, or Urdu. Certainly, I know a collection of nouns. But at the time, theories of child development in the United States said that a child raised in 2 languages would never fully master either. And my father worked long hours and wanted to be able to speak to my mother and communicate successfully with us when he got home. And so we spoke English. Add to that an infant's innate preference for its mother's voice and inflection, and here we are. I cannot hear one of the 2 consonant sounds in my own last name. Or rather, I can almost not hear it. I can tell when somebody else is pronouncing my name correctly, but I cannot quite pin down the sound. Sometimes, with great effort and several attempts, I can passably replicate the sound. I cannot, however, rattle it off naturally as one rattles off one's own name. It is worth noting that many an Indian person, certainly my own relatives, whether or not they share the name, but also various aunties and uncles whom I'm only meeting for the first time, have felt free both in my childhood and in my adulthood to correct me on the pronunciation of my own name. My name is a shibboleth, letting any member of the Indian community, or honestly, any non-South Asian person who has put serious time and effort into learning South Asian languages, that I am in the end not authentic. All I have to do in order to fail the most basic authenticity self is introduce myself. I have failed before I have even begun. And you know, it's a really interesting thing, I say as I turn to the last section that I'm going to read. I will, in the same way that I will decide, particularly with white people, if you ask me where I'm from, I really don't mind that question. Like, I'm totally fine with the question, where are you from? But when I answer you and tell you New Haven, Connecticut, if you follow up with something that's about New Haven, Connecticut, right? A question about Yale, a question about pizza, there really isn't that much else to say about New Haven. It's really Yale or pizza. Then I like you. I know that you're a good person. You're someone I can play ball with. And if you ask where I'm really from, like, I'm taking mental notes in my head. I'll give you one more chance. I'll backtrack and I'll tell you that I'm from Woodbridge, the suburb where I'm really from, and where incidentally the greater New Haven JCC is. Just pitch into the crowd a little bit here, right? Then like, that's sort of your reprieve. And if you blow that and push again, then I know you're not somebody I'm ever gonna play ball with. I litmus test South Asians in the same way. If I introduce myself and you talk to me about how I should be pronouncing my last name, you don't get a second chance. Like, we're done. We're absolutely done. And when I think about this, I think about, there is an NPR correspondent named Lakshmi Singh. And the sort of Indian pronunciation of that name is Lakshmi. And Lakshmi Singh is like, look, my family's from Trinidad and Tobago. This is how we say it, right? I really end up thinking, like, how somebody says their name, that's their name. I know that my pronunciation isn't the sort of correct Hindi pronunciation, but I'm the one wandering around with the name, right? And so every time I hear Lakshmi Singh on NPR, I feel a real kinship. I've never met Lakshmi Singh. I assume I never will. But man, she is my favorite, and that is why. So this is the last bit that I'm going to read, and then I'm going to invite Jennifer up. My father loved America with a passion for all he believed it could be. But part of that love meant believing that his adopted country was a place where people were judged not on the color of your skin, but on the content of your character. If Martin Luther King was articulating a dream, my father needed to believe that he lived in a version of the United States in which that dream was actualized. On the white side of my family, it was an unspoken assumption that racism was only the big things, the police beating Rodney King on the news or kneeling on George Floyd's neck. If you disapprove of that racism, if you march against it, or buy, and maybe even read, the books that the independent bookstores put in their windows about racial justice, then you cannot possibly be racist. Even more so, if you call the resulting unrests protests rather than riots, if you bemoan that people are more concerned with loss of property than with loss of life, with generations who have seen their dreams deferred until they sag like a heavy load and then perhaps explode, and particularly if you know whom I just referenced, Langston Hughes, in case anyone is wondering, then you cannot possibly do things that are racist. And additionally, actions taken by other well-meaning liberal or progressive people cannot possibly be racist. Certainly, what this means is that if a well-meaning liberal or progressive person loves someone across a racial line, as my white family loves me, it is hard for them to see that our interactions are, at least at times, shaped by that racial line and its power dynamics. It is hard for them to see, and therefore was hard for me to learn to see and to name, that these interactions with people who loved me, were invested in me, were shaped by systemic racism. It's hard to know what to do when the racism is present in your private space, in your home, in your family. I am deliberately drawing a distinction between the actions that people take and their essences. We all do racist things. We are all implicated and shaped in our unconscious by the systems that govern our society. My goal here is not to demonize people, but to parse out the harm that that inability to see racism does to people of color in white families, and to see what racism does to the relationships valued by both people of color and their white families. And if I were like editing this, right, like if I had a red pen in my hand, I would say, and also their friends. In the same way that I would argue as a feminist that patriarchy hurts men, not as much as it hurts women and non-binary people, but in real and substantial ways, unexamined systemic racism hurts white people, perhaps particularly those who want to be in loving relationship with people of color. So thank you for listening to me read. And I would like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Jennifer Ho. Jennifer, please come up and join me. Dr. Ho is the director of the Center for Humanities and Arts at CU Boulder and the immediate past president of the Association for Asian American Studies. And in fact, as she reminded me, and I had not forgotten, but as she reminded me in the green room earlier, am her object of study. She studies multi-ethnic sort of Asian American families. And so it is an example of how much I trust her that I've invited her up when I am in fact a primary source.
Okay, so I'm going to keep my mask on, but I've got this nice mic and I can talk loud, and hopefully that's not going to be too hard for any of the live stream people. And of course, I want to say you have really written a tremendous book, Samira. So thank you for this book.
Thank you so much for saying that, and I really appreciate your being here.
So I have many questions. I actually cut these down, and Samira has read them, so she knows what to expect. And she actually, and also Samira is obviously an amazing scholar and teacher because she has teed me up for the first question. And we will have time for you to also ask Samira direct questions.
And I'm just going to note that because I really wanted Jennifer to be fully comfortable and to be able to stay masked, I'm going to repeat the questions just in case that makes it easier for the folks on the live stream.
So let's dive right in.
Let's go.
We're going to talk about racism. I know that's a word that people have disagreement over and strong feelings about, and I'm so glad that you use the word racism right in the title of the book. You talk explicitly about the racism of the people who love you being linked to systemic racism, such as on page 104, what you just read from. Can you talk more about systemic racism and how that may or may not be different from racism? So let's parse that out first.
You know, my mother, on my birthday, called my grandmother to talk to her about this book. My grandmother is a 98-year-old white lady. And my mother was worried about how my grandmother would feel about the word racism in the title. And my grandmother said to my mother, "Oh, Linda, racism doesn't only mean the things it meant when you were a girl." And my mother said, and I have to say, my grandmother's kids are pretty good sports about the fact that my grandmother is clearly not done bringing them up. So my mother said, well, that's right. It means all of those little things and the blind spots that you have, and things like wondering, this would be an ableism example, but wondering if the word blind spot is ableist, right? Like all of those little places where you don't notice things, or also all of those assumptions and the default to an assumption that assumes whiteness. And so they had this conversation about it. But what my grandmother said, and in her comment, it's not just what it was, it's not just the things it was when you were a girl. She said, you know, like cross-burning and white supremacy. So for my grandmother, white supremacy is cross-burning, right? And I think for me, white supremacy are those assumptions that people make. And these are really heavy words, racism, white supremacy. But it's sort of saying, like, what does it mean to live in a world that is designed for a particular kind of person? And what does it mean when you're not that kind of person, right? And I think that that is a useful way of thinking about white supremacy. And I think racism, again, it's the sort of what happens when you're expecting other people to default to your norm, and what are the ways in which there is retribution when they don't. And I think that's kind of how I understand them.
I guess, so let me, because the second part of the question was dealing with white supremacy. Can we talk about systemic racism without talking about white supremacy? In the United States.
I was going to say,
States,
yes, absolutely, but I'm not sure in the United States.
Yeah.
I think that for me, racism is about power. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is, you know, I wouldn't say that every single essay in the book is about the racism of people who love you. I did that thing where you have a collection of essays and the title of one of the essays becomes the title of the book. But I really deliberately didn't talk about my interactions with my Indian family, which are, to be clear, more awful than my interactions with my white family. They're often a little bit less hurtful because the white family, I'm always surprised. And so, like, in the surprise, there's pain. But the Indian family was sort of much more overt in what it was up to. And so you would think I would be more likely to call that racism, but I don't, because they don't hold the kind of power, right? They don't have the societal backing. Now, if I were in India, right, like if my mom and her siblings had been the people to be the immigrants, that I can imagine that that dynamic might be reversed. But here in the United States, I deliberately didn't use the word racism when talking about the interactions with the Indian family, because it's not backed up by that power of white supremacy.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question.
Here we go.
When did you first start to notice the racism of people you're close to, that love you, and who love you? And in other words, when did you associate that what you were experiencing, as you describe in the book, was racism rather than just moments of discomfort or shame?
You know, and I'm really embarrassed about the answer to this question. I think it was in the conversation that I talked about while I was reading. Or not the conversation that he and I had in that restaurant, but the conversation, the original fight. So that fight happened when I was 31, and he was sort of saying, like, you know, if you look like the people who they know to be terrorists and it keeps all of us, including you, safer, why are you objecting? And I was pushing back, and I was really upset. So I was not at my most articulate. I was, at one point, I also decided he was sexist because he told me not to fight with feelings, to use logic and not feelings, and I like went through the roof. It was a terrible fight, and somewhere in there, he distilled what I was saying to him, and he said, "Are you telling me that you think I'm a racist?" And I stared at him because all of a sudden I couldn't say no. Like, that was in fact what I was telling him. And he said, "That's great, Samira. That's really just great." And, you know, to a liberal white person, telling them that they're a racist is like basically the worst thing you could possibly say, right? And especially he's Southern, right? So it really strikes at sort of everything he has defined himself against all of his life. And I couldn't say no to him. Neither of us slept that night, right? Like, I'm not positive about that, but I like went back to the guest room and didn't sleep, and he sure acted the next day like someone who hadn't had any sleep. And from then until we had the conversation in the restaurant that really, like, in which he gave me his permission and blessing to write the book, and he was like, "I really think you should," I started reevaluating all of those memories of shame and pain in light of that argument. but it was when I was 31, and one of my dearest friends said to me, "Are you calling me a racist?" I was like, oh my God, yes. Yes, I am.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. On the note of shame.
Yeah.
So you mentioned feeling shame at various points in your essays. Do you think that what you felt was internalized shame from the racism you were experiencing, or deliberate moments of harm where the intention was to cause you to feel shame? And so while intention is not and never should be the mitigating factor when experiencing harm from loved ones, it does often help in the healing process, right? So this, what you're describing as the second conversation to happen with your friend. A process of accountability, a process to know whether there was an intention to shame rather than a reaction of shame.
So you're asking me about shame and like whether or not I think it was intentional. And I think that it's part of what makes that question complicated for me is so often I'm talking about the people who were bringing me up. And I think that, you know, I was a little kid in the 1980s. I was a teenager in the early to mid 90s. I just turned 45, if anyone's trying to do the math. And shame was, in some ways, a parenting tool. Now, it wasn't a parenting tool of my mother. And to the extent that my father was like sort of taking my mother's lead and following the instructions for how the kids were going to be brought up, it wasn't one of his tools either. Although I think he was a very loving parent, but he was a much less reflective parent. And so I think that particularly for my mom and her siblings, and my dad and his siblings, shame was kind of part of how they were brought up and taught what was right behavior. So for my mother, and I think also probably for the aunt and uncle whose kids are the cousins that I really grew up with, they tried very hard to eradicate shame from sort of the upbringing. But most of the other aunts and uncles, my cousins, are a lot younger. And so they weren't actively thinking about how to interact with kids. They were just sort of following the scripts that they had. And I have cousins who are older than me, but all of them lived in India. I'm the oldest of the American-born cousins, and one cousin came here as a teenager when like he was 14 and I was 12, or 15 and 11 or whatever. But I was the oldest of and my dad's siblings are quite a bit younger. My dad, his next sibling who stayed in India is 6 years younger, but everyone else is like 8 to 20 years younger than he is. So they were really young adults, and parenting, again, wasn't on their radar, and so they were going with these scripts, and they were scripts about shame. So shame was, I think, actually kind of deliberate in training behavior. But it wasn't necessarily racialized shame. So with the Indian relatives, I think it was, because so often the discipline was like about not being Indian enough, things that I didn't know, failing to show respect in the right way. And like a good example of this would be in the United States, right? You show respect by making eye contact in the same way that I'm making eye contact with you right now, unless I'm turning to try to make eye contact with people in the audience. And in India, you wouldn't make eye contact, right? That's a brazen behavior. You would look down. And so I would get in trouble for making eye contact, particularly when being dressed down for something else. And, but it wasn't racialized shame, right? Like at least on my mom's side of the family, the shame that you would get from using your own knife to stick in the butter knife instead of using the butter knife, like that would also elicit the same reaction. But yeah, I do think it was deliberate a lot of the time. But again, not necessarily because anyone was aware of it or conscious of it so much as because that was part of how all of these folks who weren't thinking about how they might want to be different than their parents were raising their kids.
Yeah, so it was a kind of a way of correcting or trying to bring you in line with who they thought you should be.
Right. The one kind of counterexample to the argument that I just made, where I sometimes wonder, I still actually think it was about upbringing. But I came downstairs, and I write about this in the book, in a salwar kameez, which is like if the sort of Indian dress that you might think of, like if you think of, I was gonna date myself by saying Indira Gandhi, but if you think of like the sort of drapey silk outfit, that's a sari. A salwar kameez is the sort of long tunic with the sort of baggy pants, or sometimes they're really tight pants. That's actually a churidar pajama. But I came downstairs, I actually don't remember whether it was a salwar kameez or a churidar pajama. And my aunt, who was one of the white aunts, said, "So you're super ethnic now?" And I can't imagine that she didn't think that was gonna elicit shame. And I don't know why she did it, right? I was living with her. I know that she was anxious about protecting me from racism in the city that we lived in. Was she worried about what was gonna happen when I walked out of the house? Was she just disconcerted? Again, in really liberal settings, you get a lot of exoticization, right, of the East. And my aunt would be the kind of person who, because of her interactions with my dad's family, would feel uncomfortable about, would know that that was something that maybe one shouldn't do. Was she therefore identifying with me and forgetting that because I'm half Indian, I have a different relationship to Indianness than she would have as a white woman? And even my mom, who like on the one hand is a white woman and on the other hand was a wife in an Indian family for 40 years. So my mom wore Indian clothes all of the time, although interestingly hasn't since she's been widowed. Even with like my dad's family being like, you know, we're right here, you can wear a sari to the wedding, like you're with us, you're good, right? Like, but like, was my aunt thinking of that? Was my aunt correcting me in the same way that my mother, without my father standing next to her, doesn't wear those outfits anymore? But again, I can't imagine, what on earth did she think I was gonna feel if it wasn't shame?
Right, right. No, I mean, I think that, you know, the theme of shame I was really struck by, which I think is tied to racism. And so, you know, that leads me to my next question, which is when you started to write these essays, which you say happened when you were in Philadelphia, did you think you were always gonna publish them, or did you wanna publish them? Because I feel like there's the writing of the things that you want to delve into, but then there's the publishing of them.
So I started writing them after the conversation with my friend in the restaurant. And I was in DC for that year, but when I talk about them, I talk about starting to write them in Philadelphia. And I was like, why? At first I was like, oh, wait a minute, I've got my story wrong somehow, right? Like I'm like, what did I misremember about my life? And actually, I think the answer is that during that year that I was in DC, like my friend who I was talking to was like, you should write about these. This is important. And so I did, and he meant for publication, but I just started journaling about it. And it was the next year I moved to Philly, and started to talk about, I had been in conversation for a long time with my editor at Beacon. She actually taught me how to write a book proposal when I submitted my first academic book to someone else. She's someone who's been a mentor for a long time. And so she was like, you know, we should really, that thing, you've done your first book, you've done your tenure book, you could write for me now. And so I was sort of thinking about it. And when I really started to write these essays, the nephew who I dedicated the book to is a biracial child adopted by white parents. And I came home from holding him for the first time, and I took those journal entries that I had been writing for a year and a half, and I went to my favorite coffee shop in Philadelphia, and I started to turn them into essays that I could give to my editor friend. And so I had been journaling about it and trying to figure out, like, could I write about this for the public? But it was spending an afternoon holding that little biracial baby the father that is actually not my really close longtime friend, but who is now, of course, also a close friend, or I guess not of course, but I'm lucky, he's also a close friend, said to me, you interrupt us if you see us doing the wrong thing. You stop us. And kind of with that mandate, I went home to write these essays.
That's really lovely. Yeah, I mean, because I feel like there is so much we can learn about these.
I have to tell you, they sent me a video that child is now 5, or almost 5. His birthday is next month. He would be really proud that I just said he was 5. And So they sent me a video of him reading the dedication and like spelling out the letters and realizing that it's his name. Then he turned the pages and he says to my college friend, his father, it's newspapers. So I wrote this entire book for somebody who, you know, cannot even begin to fathom why I wrote him a book that isn't a picture book. It's newspapers.
He'll get there. He'll get
so
there.
I have to warn those of you who are planning on buying the book, it's newspapers.
Okay, so he may not be your primary audience right now, right? But who is, right? So in other words, who is, you know, you talk about having him in mind as an inspiration to actually take them from a journal into a published form like this. So I guess I'm wondering who the ideal audience is for this book, and if you've noticed, and it may be too soon, because you know, the book just came out, but have you noticed a difference in how people of color versus white people are approaching this book?
So, in part because he was my inspiration, and he is a biracial child adopted by white parents, in some ways the initial audience that I was thinking of were white family members of people of color. White family members by adoption, white family members like my mom and her side of my family, white family members like the person I didn't marry and his family, and I didn't write about them, but some of the reasons I didn't marry, like some of what went wrong there was tied to sort of missteps. And I think both sides, but missteps around this kind of thing. And so in some ways that was my original audience because my friend's husband said, tell us when we go wrong. And that part, a grad school friend of mine wrote me this massively long text about what it was like to read the book as a white mother of brown children and how she can't force her kids to read anything, but she hopes they will. She's going to buy it for them and give it to them. And she said she's going to find out if you can buy books by the case like you can buy wine, because she's going to give it to all of the aunts and uncles on both sides of the family. She just felt like I was giving her kids tools for things that she's watched them experience or things that she sometimes wonders, like, are they able to express. And then another really, really close friend who is Asian American, married to a white man, she interviewed me she writes for something called The Anxious Bench. And she was talking about how she wants her daughter, who's a teenager, to read it. She's really curious about what her daughter will think, and I'm also very curious. And so I'm realizing that parents of mixed race children or teens, the grad school friend has kids in their 20s, really are finding this book to be spectacular. And my friend from grad school asked me to thank my mother. And it's important to me that everyone knows, right? My mom read a draft before I gave it to the editor, like before I submitted it. She also did the copy edits with me and the page proofs because she is a professional editor. She spent a lot of time with this book, and she described it as hard to read in places, but fair. She is also really pained by my comma use, I have to say, really pained. But so that's an audience that I didn't, in some ways that's exactly who I was writing for, but I didn't expect it to hit home. I've heard from people who don't identify as mixed race, Asian American people, but also some Black people, that they really see themselves in this experience. I did a radio interview with a DC TV radio show called We the People, and the person interviewing me talked about that, certainly beforehand. I don't remember if he said that on the air. But the thing that has broken my heart, I've gotten some emails and direct messages on Twitter from total strangers. Asian, white, mixed, total strangers. People telling me that they're taking the book to their therapists. People writing to thank me. And I realized Meghan Markle, so I've watched some of the Netflix series, the Meghan Markle, Prince Harry. If there's an afterlife, I really hope my father, who hated the British monarchy I can't even begin to describe, is not listening. But Meghan Markle comments that nobody talks about being mixed. And definitely people are talking about it more, right? But oh man, the messages I'm getting, they're heartbreaking.
Yeah, no, as somebody who, again, studies this area, we need more stories from multiracial people to dive deep into the things that are hard to talk about, but are really necessary to talk about, especially if you want to continue to be in close, intimate relationships with others.
Right.
And, I will say, and I'm going to jump to this question, so many of your essays resonated with me, right? So I'm not mixed race identified, but the question of where are you from, and where are you really from is, I think, one of the things that if you're Asian American identified in the United States, that's what unites us, right? And so what I was wondering, because I too truly hate that question, and I too sort of use it as a barometer, right, of how we can be in relationship to each other. If people ask me that, I give an answer and they keep pressing. But what I'm wondering about is, have you ever had a meaningful conversation come from that question or a similar iteration of that question? Because I have. And I have in a way that made me realize that sometimes there's another reason behind the question other than the assumptions I made about white supremacy. And I don't want to make it about me, so I'm not going to explain what it is, but I'm just curious if you have had that experience where somebody's pressing you, but actually there's something else.
So I haven't, which in no way do I mean to dismiss your experience of having that happen. I think that I get very bristly when that question happens, and it's possible that I don't give people the space to come back with something different. I don't want to hear about your trip to India. I don't want to hear about your yoga practice. I don't want to hear about your guru. I really don't want you to tell me, like you ask everyone, you just like to guess where people are from, unless I can point to anyone else in the Oneg. Oneg is like a happy hour in a synagogue. And tell me, like, where in the Pale of the Settlement their ancestors are from. Like, I don't want to hear it. And I don't really give people that opportunity. I do, however, have a running joke. One of my closest friends is Asian American, and I'm always asking her about the food of her people. And she's from Michigan. And so what I'm really asking about is cream sauce.
I was thinking maybe hot dish.
Okay, so I said to her once, I have a question about the food of your people. Is hot dish just casserole? And she sighed very dramatically, and she said, hot dish is from Minnesota. I am from Michigan.
Interesting. So it's not a Midwest thing. It's a really particular Is anyone from Minnesota? So hot dish is purely Minnesotan? Yeah, I was always told hot dish was Midwestern. I mean, I'm happy to be corrected.
I mean, so according to Dr. Melissa Borja of the American Studies Department at the University of Michigan, a hot dish is from Minnesota.
Okay. All right. I actually know Melissa, so I'm going to take that. Joy, how much time do we have? Because there's definitely one question I want to end with, but...
That sounds perfect. One more question would be great.
Okay, great. So here's my last question. What's the main takeaway? Right? So if, we're hoping that people are going to buy your book. We're hoping people obviously will read the book. We've got lots of people
Oprah's
online.
been good for that, I think.
Yes. So what do you hope readers will take away from the collection?
I really hope that when people read this book, they experience it. So one of my all-time sort of heroes or sheroes, if you want to go that route in language, is Loretta Ross, who is one of the founders of the reproductive justice movement. And she's a professor at Smith, and she talks about call-in culture rather than call-out culture. So I really hope that people will experience this book as call-in, to really think about sort of what are the assumptions that they bring to the table? I write about in the book how when you sort of say to somebody that was racist, the thing is that racism is such a polarizing thing in American culture, and it's such a painful thing to say to well-meaning white liberals and progressives who want their intent to matter, right? And we've got kind of a one-drop rule with racism, right? You did one racist thing, and all of a sudden, the space collapses between you, a person who is just trying your hardest, and like the people marching through the streets of Charlottesville, right? And I want to create a world in which people can make mistakes and ask questions that I think are racist, and know that the question is the racist thing, not the person, right? And that doesn't mean that I think everyone gets a pass on everything for all time. But a world in which, the relationships are strong enough that people can make mistakes, that people can learn and grow from those mistakes. Like, it's really important to note that I wrote an entire essay about this friend's racism. And also, one of the things I need to do this spring is write a will in which I'm going to probably name him the executor, right? Like, this is somebody who is one of the bedrock relationships of my life. And we didn't handle it well when we had that fight, right? We didn't handle it well. And again, I'm not saying everyone forgive the people who do racist things to you. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is you need to be able, he forgave me for accusing him of the worst thing he could imagine. And I let him grow and gave him the space to learn from that experience and turn into somebody who, the only reason he didn't read all of this was that he was really busy and he trusted me. So he read he comes up in another part of the book and he was listening to the audiobook and he got really excited about it. He's like, there I am. But that trust is there, right? You need real relationship to have that. Mm. And that's not something available everywhere. And there are lots of things I struggle with, right? Like, what happens when there's a behavior that somebody in your family or your chosen family does, and you've learned to forgive it, and then you come across it in your workplace? Are you a bad ally to the other people of color because you've made your peace with this behavior and you're not up in arms about it? Or are you a person who can be a bridge in that situation? And I think sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other, right? But that's the piece, right? How do we call in? I really don't want to be hokey and end by saying, how do we create beloved community? But I don't mean it in a hokey way. I'm a religion scholar, and I mean it in its original, really theologically robust and hard way.
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful place to end. Thank you. Thank you, Samira.
So we have an opportunity for a few questions. I'm sure I see a lot of hands coming up right now.
I listened to your book on Audible and started listening to it a second time. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And I want to ask you, what prompted you to decide to convert to Judaism? And what have you seen in the Jewish community with Jews of color in terms of how they are treated and welcomed or not welcomed in the Jewish community?
So the story of why I converted is long and personal, and in some ways it's a story of growing up in a really, really Jewish place, and then moving to a really, really, really neither Jewish nor Unitarian place and feeling more at home in the Jewish spaces in that setting than I did in the Unitarian spaces. In some ways it's a story of spending 6 years with a Jewish man in friendship and then in relationship, and during the part that we were in a relationship, planning to have a Jewish home and raising Jewish kids, and then putting it all aside and being like, I will not cling to my past, and then several years later being like, oh wait, what if there's a difference between clinging to your past and being changed by the life that you've lived, right? What if those are actually different things? And it's in some ways it's figuring out what is the religious community that is struggling with issues that you care about in a framework that really works for you. I will say, when I lived in Atlanta, I liked to say that I belonged to a wonderful progressive Jewish community where I really felt at home, and also I experienced more racism in that progressive Jewish community than anywhere else in my life in Atlanta. And some of that is that I really carefully controlled the life. I went to the university, I went to the knitting store, I went to the synagogue. That was where I had my friends, that was my world. Atlanta is a really integrated city, so more than anywhere else I've ever lived, you can be in a restaurant and people of all races will be, not all walks of life, because like you've price pointed yourself with the restaurant, right? But like the restaurants are really integrated, the sort of social spaces are really integrated a lot of the time. Not always and not consistently, and I think it's more that I think there are spaces where white people probably don't go as often, but like everywhere I went, I was never the only person of color, which is not what it's like where I grew up. It's not what it's, certainly not what it's like here. And it was in the synagogue, and I think that it was a couple of things, right? Partly that was the place where people would let their guard down. People are thinking about it as a homogenous community. And it's the place where people would be horribly offended if people said, "Where are you from?" And I would say Connecticut, and they would press. And that is the place where I would say, "I want you to know I experienced this as a racist question," because I totally knew that the rabbi had my back. And people would be really offended, again, because they're so their identity as a progressive person is central to their core, and so they can hear no feedback on it, right? But also, like, universities are outrageously racist spaces. I can say that now because I have tenure. Universities are outrageously racist spaces, but the casual comments are, to me, at least in my experience, the sort of manners are better, right? Like people have sort of gotten the notice on what they're not supposed to say. And a synagogue, like you have no idea what people know or don't know about what they're supposed to say or not, right? I'm starting a massive project, or I'm about a year into a massive project. Jennifer is part of it with me, called Jews of Color, Histories and Futures. And starting this summer, we're going to start really recording and documenting the stories of Jews of color. And I expect them to be rich and beautiful, and I also expect there to be a lot of painful stories of racism. I think that's just probably what's gonna happen. And I have to say, one of the things that, I've got a couple of friends who have listened to the audiobook, and you can all tell me if this is true, but, or those, you can tell me. I've been told that it sounds so much like me, my writing sounds so much like me talking, that it's freaking people out that I'm not the reader on the audiobook. I, meanwhile, am pretty sure I wouldn't have been good at it and am delighted by the reader on the audiobook. But apparently, my very oldest friend is totally freaked by this.
All right. I have a question because I had a very wise professor tell me that it is not my job to educate my white classmates on intersectionality and racism. What made you decide that it was your turn to tell your stories experiencing this and essentially educate people from your past?
I think part of it is that I'm not trying to educate people from my past, I'm trying to educate people in my nephew's future. Right? I'm not sure I would have done this if it weren't for him. And it turns out, of course, that some of my relatives are reading it, and some of my relatives, I think, are a little worried to read it. My grandmother found out from my mom that Amazon takes a huge cut and ordered it from the publisher in case I'd get more royalties. I don't. But, right, like, my grandmother's super supportive. I don't want to hurt the people in my family that I really love. And I'm sure I have, right? There's like no way around the fact that that's what's happened. And for me, I wanted to say what I had to say without worrying about whether or not I would hurt them, because I want the world to be different. You know, I think what your professor probably meant in that moment is it's not your job to sacrifice getting your education or feeling good or safe in your learning space while you're learning. That's what you're doing, right? But that's a particular moment in a particular context. You don't have that responsibility. I don't have that responsibility, right? It's not my job to educate my colleagues. It sometimes ends up being what happens. I've been pretty lucky to have some pretty awesome white allies who pick up that work a lot of the time. But it's not my job in my workspace necessarily to do that. It's not my job in all of my professional spaces, but it is all of our jobs when the opportunity presents, I think, to try to create the world that we want to have, right? But like, not all of the time, every day, in every single space.
Another question?
Hi there. My question comes from personal experience. I'm curious if you've ever contemplated what your experiences and your upbringing and everything like that would be if the roles were reversed on which genes necessarily took precedence in your appearance. So I may not look like it, but I am also biracial. My one side is all basically everything you would consider white. The other side is Latino, but the majority of that is Spanish. So I look like this. And part of me figuring out myself and how my life could be different was contemplating if those roles were reversed. You know, if I looked a different way to other people, if I looked more like my mom, if I, appeared, and I would be concerned about people coming up to me and asking me where I'm from. I'm just curious if that has ever crossed your mind.
So while I was writing these essays, I was hanging out a lot with somebody else who's biracial, who has a Chinese parent and a white parent, who looks really, really, really ethnically ambiguous, but who looked super Asian as a kid, and who talked a lot about like what that change, or not a lot, but like brought up in conversation what that change was like, right? Like to go from early memories of really horrible and vitriolic anti-Asian racism, and then being somebody who sometimes went in like POC space, person of color space, gets checked, like gets asked to check his privilege, or like there's a question about exactly how welcome is he in that space. And I think that that's really real. I think that, there are things that absolutely aren't part of the experience if you come across white looking. You've got skin privilege. You're safer when you're pulled over by the cops. I got my first ever speeding ticket in rural Montana, or not Montana, rural Wyoming. I've never been to Montana. I don't know why that came out of my mouth. In rural Wyoming. And I was on the phone with my very, very white boss. And so I got off the phone because I was getting pulled over and realized that when I like called back after it was all over, he was like basically having heart failure because I had been pulled over. I was in the car with a Latinx drag queen. He was like, oh my God, I'm gonna have to go get them out of jail. And he was so panicked. I only found out later that he was imagining jail. I thought he was imagining death, right? Because he was so scared. And that is something that is God willing, is not part of your experience in the same way. And I think it's important to be aware of that, but it's also important to realize that you also need the spaces that allow you to process your heritage and celebrate your heritage. And there will be moments of discrimination. Of course, it also matters what your name is, right? Like, not only how do the genes express, but what is your name? Yeah, I can't see your name tag from here, but right, so like, what is your name? And so these things become invisible. And that's different and hard and painful in other ways. And because of the ways in which you've got the skin privilege, I think we're not very good at making space for that a lot of the time, right? We're not very good at making space for the fact that you're also really all of the parts of who you are, right? Just like I'm not a bad Indian because when I get sick, I want matzo ball soup and not khichdi. You're also very much the half of your heritage that people aren't looking at when they see you. And I would imagine that there's a lot that's complicated there, right? And my sister and I, in some ways, look a lot alike, but often are read really differently. I'm read as Indian or Middle Eastern. She's often read as Latina. And she's not, although she did get very, very good at Spanish because she said it was really hard to not be able to give people directions when they asked her for help. And so, again, moves through the world sometimes pretty differently. The assumptions are different, right? Not necessarily better or worse, but really different.
Another question? I've got one for you. Samira, I am curious, what else are you working on?
So I have this really bad habit of getting book contracts before I have books or and having more than one at a time, which I have to say is stressful. So I have 2 books under contract. One is a book called God Bless the Pill, Contraception and Sexuality in Tri-Faith America. I suspect that last part will change because if you're a scholar of American religion, which I am, you think that Tri-Faith America means Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, and it's a reference to a particular, everybody else thinks it means Christians, Jews, and Muslims. So I suspect that that other part will change, and it's a religious history of contraception. A bunch of my students are in the room, and so it's kind of the parts of religion and reproductive politics in the United States that are not about abortion and not about forced sterilization. Everything in that class that's about contraception, that's what's in that book. Turns out that a lot of early support for contraception and access of contraception came from Protestant and Jewish clergy, and some renegade Catholic clergy as well. And then the second book is called A Mixed Multitude, and it's a history of Jews of color in the United States, starting basically around World War I and coming up to the present, so roughly the last 100 years. So those are the things that I'm working on.
I can't wait. I can't wait to read them. I can't wait to hear about your talk together. And I just want to thank you both for such a wonderful conversation. And yes, please. I want to let you all know that we'll be sending out a survey tomorrow, and we hope you take 2 minutes to fill it out. We really appreciate your feedback, and it's essential for our funding. And there's so many wonderful programs coming up at the JCC. You're invited to all of them, but particularly I'd like to invite you to one on February 15th. It's with CU's Playback Theater for an evening of thought-provoking art, insight, connection, and community. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Can you please give them another round of applause? Thank you. Please join us for the book signing and for some more appetizers.
Joy, tell them about next Wednesday night.
Next Wednesday night, we have Jonathan Lev speaking here.
The author of Hidden Valley Road.
We'll send out information about Hidden Valley Road on your follow-up also and let you all know about it. Another great author talk. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.